thank you so much for being here again today, listening to our colleague, Maribel Fierro. And today she will be focusing on Ibn Rushd, on his political side. I have a suggestion, a little change in the program. We will be doing all the session in continuity with just the break for the cafe at 10:30, and we will have lunch in the end. That is to say, after the work you will be doing with Ismail Asban and Lucie Tardy, you come back immediately to this hall and have the summarize and the question you will be preparing for Ms. Fierro, and at 2 p.m. the lunch, because time to time we wait for the lunch, it is not always ready, and time to time after the lunch maybe you are tired and you are not that much able to do intellectual work. So that's my proposal. Thank you again, dear Maribel Fierro, for your generosity. I'm so sorry that your thrust is a little bit, you got cold, and nevertheless you will be giving your lecture at your rhythm with much easiness as you can. Thank you so much. So your title is already on the screen, Ibn Rushd's comment on his own times. The floor is yours for about 1 hour.
Thank you so much, and good morning to you all. And I hope I won't get too stressed with my bronchitis. So you will excuse me if I start coughing or anything. So I want to start saying that this is still very much work in progress. As you have seen, I've been working for a long time on the Almohads, and it's taking me a lot of time. I usually take things, I don't like to rush with things, because I think thinking, if you are not a genius like Ibn Rushd, takes time to think about. So what I'm presenting here is my first approach to this topic. Reduced also because yesterday I had put too much material. So I will start just giving a brief overview, because I'm going to talk about Ibn Rushd commenting on his own times. So just briefly, without going too much into the political history of the time, just to remind you that the Almohad Caliphate lasted for 142 years, with many changes happening during this time. As we shall see, one big change, as I will mention, is that at a certain moment in the 13th century, the Mahdist element of the Almohads was renounced. So in those coins that I show you, in which appears Allahu Rabbuna, Muhammad Rasuluna, Al-Mahdi Imamuna disappears, and instead of Al-Mahdi, they start saying Al-Quran Imamuna. So this is one of the changes. This always happens in every dynasty. History is mainly change, and the Almohads underwent many changes. This one of the biggest. And what was renounced was Mahdism, which was always the most controversial element of the Almohad experience. It started, we don't know exactly at what time. Almohad historiography says that when Ben Tumar, who had come from the east and had gone back to his old village in Igilis, at a certain moment he went into a cavern and appeared after 3 days, and he proclaimed himself the Mahdi. So, being the Mahdi is proclaiming himself the Mahdi was a big move. This is a big claim, which is not usual in Sunni context. And as I said, the Almohads never claimed to be Shiis. There is a chapter in the Kitab of Bentumart in which he talks about Mahdi. And one of the things he said is that the foundations of falsehood became so deeply rooted that its branches flourished, and all of humanity came to see nothing before their eyes except such branches issuing from such roots. Then the Mahdi came fi zaman al-ghurba, which is an idea that we have already seen yesterday and that we'll elaborate a bit more. When inversion had taken hold. In him, so he came fi zaman al-ghurba when the world was upside down, and then he came and put it right again. Truth restored and the rules transformed. God singled him out, Hassasahu, and this term in which he's referred to this idea that he has a Hassa, we shall see that when Ben Rouge will talk about Bentumar, he will use this term. He doesn't use Isma, he refers to his Hassa, whatever it is. By entrusting him with the meanings of guidance, the Hassa seems that he is able to guide others. That's what a Mahdi does, no? The root says that you are one that rightly guides others because yourself are rightly guided yourself, no? The obedience given to him is pure and complete. Such obedience has never existed before nor after. He has no equal among humankind, which is a big claim. Because this is something that you will expect being told about the Prophet Muhammad, or as we shall see by Ibn Rushd, that's what he says about Aristotle. But in the Kitab of Bentumart is the Mahdi who has no equal among humankind. So the movement starts with a Mahdi, and his successor, the Mahdi, died without any children. We don't know that he married ever. And his successor was one of his students, who was not a Masmuda, but a Zanata, Abdul Mumin. And the way the Almohads differentiated themselves from the Almoravids, apart from saying the Almoravids are heretics because they are Mujassima, because they are anthropomorphists, and therefore jihad can be made against them, was we proclaim our own caliphate, not like the Almoravids did, that they paid obedience to the Abbasids in Baghdad. And they minted these square coins that I insist. Why do I insist so much? Because this is what people in the territories conquered by the Almohads saw all the time. They didn't see the caliph so much. They didn't see perhaps the square Qurans, although the square Qurans, some scholars have said that they were kind of pocket books, so that the format, which is small one, was made this way in order to allow the Talaba to take with them these Qurans, small Qurans. What people saw was these kind of things. And different interpretations have been done about why they chose this square format with the circular. And one of the proposals is that it was a way of referring of the microcosm and the macrocosm. If you take this dirham, and if you have a golden dinar, and if you take the dirham, which is made of silver, you remember that the dinars are circles with a square inscribed in it. If you take the dirham and you put it in the dinar, it corresponds exactly. So you can see that they can be used also in order to teach things, not to say, well, this is the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm and so on. It's really a very ingenious move on the part of the Almohads. Here, so this corresponds exactly to the size of a silver dirham, okay? The square Qurans, and then this play with circles and squares that you find in flags, in the binding bindings of books. This is very characteristic of books produced at this time. The bindings of the books that are preserved, some of them are preserved, also show this play of squares and circles. And I remember something that I already showed to you, that no date was mentioned. There was no hijra mentioned, as if the Almohads had brought back a kind of eternal period of humankind. Mosques were purified. The call to prayer was made with formulas different from those previously used, which was also a very auditory way of indicating that a new era and a new world had started. The use of the Berber language, which is very prominent in the early times. Bentumar taught his Akida in Berber when he was in Gillis, and the teaching in Berber, we know that one, I think the preacher in Fez that they selected, he was selected because he spoke Berber. Okay, so Berber, the use of the Berber language is very central at the beginning. A local pilgrimage was established, which was again controversial, but Timal became a pilgrimage center. Ben Rushd went there with the caliph in pilgrimage. So Ben Rushd saw Timal, saw the grave of the Mahdi, and the grave of the second caliph. I wish he would have said what he thought of that, but he doesn't say anything. And then there was the forced conversion that I already mentioned. So, what can we know about Bentumart, which is a fascinating figure, and I have tried to figure out how to have an idea of what he was up to. Did he really proclaim himself Mahdi? Were his followers who proclaimed him Mahdi? What was his training? We have a source, which are the memoirs of Al-Baydak. Al-Baydak claims to have been not one of the big followers of Bentumar. He was not part of the Council of Ten. He was more a kind of servant of Bentumar, and he wrote these memoirs in which, in principle, you will think, well, that's a very good source to know about Bentumar. The problem is that when you read the sources, the book is more about Abdelmumin than about Bentumar. So the book really is trying to legitimize the fact that the successor of Bentumar was Abdelmumin, and not any other of the Council of Ten, or not the brothers of Bentumar, who eventually are killed by Abdelmumin. So I have my doubts about how to use this book to know really about Bentumar. And the first part is missing, which is supposed to be the part in which he narrates Bentumar's stay in the East. So we don't have that part, and this might have been a coincidence, this loss, or maybe what the version that appeared in these memoirs wasn't acceptable at a certain moment about Bentumar. We have the Kitab of Bentumar. 2 manuscripts are preserved. One in Paris, which is this one, and it says that these are the Sama, the notes that Abdelmumin took from Bentumar, the teachings that Bentumar was given in Gillis. So, and the other copy is also about the notes of Abdelmumin. So, Bentumar had many other students. And as you know, in the pedagogical process, students take notes. So we would expect having other notes of other students, but we don't have. So again, we see the teachings of Bentumar only through what Abdelmumin wants us to see about him. And therefore the doubt is, were there different recensions, different versions of the teachings of Bentumar? What happened to the other notebooks? Is this notebook by Abdelmumin was preserved? What about the other students? They must have been taking notes, no? And how was this work used? Because you don't see many references to the Kitab. You have references that when the Almohad caliphs were itinerant caliphs, they moved a lot. This is the well-known issue of the Mahalla, which is one of the features of the political culture in the Islamic West. And in this moving, the caliphs took with them a Quran, the Quran of Uthman, which is another story, and the Kitab of Bentumart. So it played a kind of ceremonial role, but what they did with that, how they taught it, you don't find many mentions of this Kitab in the writings of people writing under the Almohads. So it's, to me, not very clear which role it had. And this is Igillis. We are fortunate because more than 10 years ago, I could not have shown you the site where Bentumart established his ribat, because it wasn't clear where it was Igillis, but now it has been established where it was, and Moroccan-French team has been doing excavations, and it can now be visited, and it's very interesting what they have found. For example, this is what they call the command area, which is probably where Bentumart lived with his students, and you can see that it has a square format. So the square appears very soon in, and it's fascinating, all the articles that they have written. This is the Ribat of the Harga. This is Argan territory, Argan tree, and the Argan economy is what was the area about. And okay, so, and this is Timal, of course, before the earthquake, which unfortunately destroyed this very peculiar building, which also has problems of its own. Anyway, so Abdelmumin is really the founder of the empire. He was the one who managed to defeat the Almoravids and conquer Marrakesh. He was the one who managed to conquer the Maghreb al-Awsat and Ifriqiya and Al-Andalus. You see in green, oh, thank you. You see there in green the extension of the Almohad Empire. This is, again, something very special about this period. It's the first time there is the political unification of the whole of the Islamic West, not to Sicily. Sicily was in the hands of the Normans, and they couldn't take it back. And he was the founder of a caliphal dynasty, which is not a small feat, although this is the moment in which the populations of the territories that had been conquered by the Arabs start to claim that they have become Muslims. Now they can also rule themselves, not necessarily the Arabs. The Berbers are doing that. They had started already with the Almoravids. And in the east, there are the Kurds with Saladin and the Ayyubids, and there are the Turkish dynasties. So the 12th century is the time when the conquered people say, okay, and now is our time to rule ourselves, okay? And this is part of this more general process, which is also very interesting in this macro political environment. Whereas when the Persians started to also produce dynasties of their own, they could claim an imperial past that they could use to give themselves genealogies of power. I don't think, I'm sure the Berbers could have done something similar, but in fact, when they take power, they tend to give themselves Arab genealogies. And that's what, I don't know if Bentumart himself did it. For sure, Abdelmumin took an Arab genealogy, and one Arab genealogy was given to Bentumart. But the Berber origins were never forgotten of the Almohads. And I told you the story about this Jarawi poet telling the caliph, who would have thought that Azanata would become an Amir al-Mu'minin, because they had a lot of sense of humor, the Almohads. The Berber origins were never forgotten, and this is important because I'm talking mostly about Andalusi scholars, and the Berbers didn't have a good image in Al-Andalus. As I said, they created a stereotype which is very pervasive through time and which can be studied in things that we have learned, especially in the 12th century, about this matter of othering. To create your own identity, you have to create another, and usually you put positive things about yourself and you put all the negative things on the other. And that's what the Andalusis did. And they did it in at a big scale. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable reading some of the things Andalusis said about others, about Galicians, about Berbers. And if you are interested of this idea that the Andalusis invented the Berbers, there is this article by Ramzi Ruwi where he elaborates on this. So the Berbers knew that this view that Andalusis had of themselves. They also knew that the Andalusis needed them. They needed them because the Andalusis were not very much for leaning people. They didn't want to live their comfortable lives and take care of fighting against the Christians, so they needed the Berbers to do the job for them. So, but they knew that they look at them with a certain contempt and with a certain sense of superiority. So one of the accusations that were made against Ben Rushd during at the end of his life, during his so-called disgrace, was that instead of referring to the Caliph as the Caliph Amir al-Mu'minin, he said the king of the Berbers. So we can see that this could be used because they knew that this was something that the Andalusis could have in their minds. And Ben Rushd himself, when he refers to one of his stays in Marrakesh, probably his first stay in Marrakesh, shortly after the conquest, he says, "I was in the land of the Berbers." So you can see how prominent this idea is. So the Andalusis, sometimes they will say, this is Masmuda land, this is another land, but they put them all together under this umbrella of Berbers. What about the way the Almohads saw themselves? One of the chronicles produced by the Almohads is Ben Sahib as-Salat's chronicle, which is a fascinating text. Sometimes we don't realize how fascinating the literature produced by the Maghribis is until someone who works on the Mashriq discovers to us that this is very unusual. And I always remember there is a famous professor, Hugh Kennedy, who was charged with writing a history of Al-Andalus, and he read Sahib as-Salat, and he told me, "I never seen a chronicle like this one." And I never thought that it was special, but he made me realize that it was very special. So the title is Al-Man bil-Imama al-Mustadafina bi-an ja'alahu Allah a'imma, which is again a very big claim, divine favor of the imamate granted to those considered weak on earth. And this is, of course, evokes a Quranic verse which is related to the history of Moses, of Musa, and this verse was used in the history of Islamic societies, usually by revolutionary movements, because it's about the weak of earth taking power, okay? So that's, in a way, that's one of the ways in which the Almohads saw themselves, within this context of the conquered, say, well, it's enough time that we are ruled by the Arabs, it's now time that we rule ourselves. And implies a reversal of the existing order. And as I said, the Almohads did what revolutionaries do. They openly and explicitly marked the break between the old and the new times with the square coins, not using the hijra, proclaiming a caliphate, and so on. And they used a lot of violence. That is usually what revolutionaries do, especially in the early times. With all the purges, there were lots of purges and lots of internal killings of disaffected followers of Bentumart, and an ambitious propagandistic and pedagogical program to habituate their subjects to the new Almohad beliefs and way of doing things. So we need to distinguish different stages. And what the Almohads did in the beginning then became a sort of embarrassment later on. The forced conversion by the times of Al-Mansur, they started to think that it was not a good idea. And there were other things that were quite striking, like this is found in Al-Baydak's memoir, so you can date it in the time of the Al-Mumin, that all human beings were declared to be slaves of the 10 and their descendants. And we know that this was the idea. I'm not so sure to what extent what it meant in real practice, but even some decades later, they were remembering that this was the idea, that they were like having conquered all these territories, in a way like the Arabs had done with the Berbers. They had enslaved all the conquered people were their slaves. And the forced conversion, which I already mentioned. So this became things that later, by the time of the second, especially the third caliph, they looked at these early times with some embarrassment. So why forced conversion? Not Almohad tells us why they did it. We only have this short text in which Abdel Mumin says, we don't need your jizya, therefore there is no more dhimma, okay? But why did he say that? I have explored this topic and I have come with 5 possibilities. One is eschatology. What happens when the Mahdi comes, the Mahdi of the last times? There will still be different religions, so the Mahdi comes to make everybody Muslim. So, Shi'i or Fatimid influence, which is also related to eschatology. You know that under the reign of Al-Hakim, in the Fatimid Caliph, when they had moved to Egypt, he is usually presented as a mad caliph that did many odd things. And one of the odd things he did, he started to destroy churches and synagogues. And the idea, part of the explanation was that he thought the time had come, it was the change of a century, that everybody had to be Muslim. Anyway, influence of the belief that all human beings possess an innate nature, the fitra, that corresponds to Islam, whereas being a Jew or a Christian depends on the family into which one has been born. And with a Mahdi, the time had come to recover this fitra, and the universal fitra was Islam. The idea that the territory ruled by the Almohads was a new Hijaz. For a time, they discouraged the pilgrimage to Mecca, and they created their own sanctuary in Timmal. Now you know that Christians and Jews are allowed to live in all Muslim territory except in the Jazirat al-Arab, okay? So in the Hijaz, more than the Jazirat al-Arab, in the Hijaz, where the towns of Mecca and Medina were located. So maybe they thought that they were saying, because one of the prominent ideas under the Almohads, which is very prominent in the encounter between Bentumart and Abdel Mumin. Bentumart is in near Bougie, coming back from the east, and he meets Abdel Mumin, who is traveling east to study in the east. He meets Bentumart, listens to his lessons, and Abdel Mumin says, I don't need to travel to the east, because the knowledge, the ilm I'm looking for is in the Maghreb. And this is very prominent under the Almohads, the idea that they don't depend anymore on the East they have enough knowledge and they have enough resources to become independent on the East, not to feel inferior to the East. There is the site of ilm now is in the Maghreb, and this is very prominent. And in relation to this, the creation of the local sanctuary at Timal could be seen as also a way of deflecting the obsession with the East that had predominated until then in the Maghreb. And they could also be influenced by the legal doctrine of the jurist at Tabari, which was very influential but never became a madhab. What did At-Tabari say? He said, the dhimma is provisional. Once we need the Jews and the Christians, because we are a minority, we have always to remember that in the first centuries of Islamic history, Muslims were a minority. They were living in territories where the majority of the populations were non-Muslims, so they needed the Muslims for many things. And At-Tabari said, this is a demographical problem and demographical issue. Once we become the majority, we don't need anymore the Jews and Christians, so therefore the Dhimma Pact will stop. This is not, it's a minority position in Islamic law, but you can find it resurfacing from time to time. Abdelmumin, if you remember in my previous lecture, I mentioned the way Ibn Tumart structured the Almohad movement. There were this closed circle, then there were the Council of 10, then there was the Council of the 40. Abdelmumin established another layer structure. At the top, there were the earliest adherents of the movement, those who had joined before the Battle of Marrakesh in 1129, after which Ben Tumar died. Then followed those who had joined between these dates, when the Oran was conquered, and the rest, those of who had joined the Almohad cause later on. So it was a matter of, this reminds us also of the early times of Islam, where the issue of Sabiqa, who comes first, also established a hierarchical structure. So we see this, which is a normal thing to do, no, in a way. This idea I have already mentioned, that Abdelmumin needed the original Almohad tribes that had provided the military might that made possible the empire, but he also needed to check their power, because the Almohad shuyukh tended to tell him, you are primus inter pares, we are allowing you to rule, but maybe we think otherwise, okay? And what Abdelmumin wanted was to establish a dynasty. So in order to establish a dynasty and to put himself above the shuyukh, he needed to create an independent basis of power, and he did that by recruiting the Arab tribes he had defeated in Setif. These Arab tribes had been sent by the Fatimids when they were in Egypt against the Zirids of Ifriqiya, because the Zirids had stopped paying obedience to them, so they sent this Banu Hilal and Banu Sulaim that you might have heard, and that influenced a lot the later history of the Maghreb. Abdelmumin defeated them, and he incorporated them into his army, and then by establishing the Taliban. The tribal shuyukh had a vested interest in preserving the crucial role of Ben Tumart and in checking the influence of the Taliban. The shuyukh saw the move of Abdelmumin, and they tried to also check the caliphal power. So this is very interesting, how the different things they did. And as I said, the disgrace of Averroes, I think in the disgrace of Averroes there were many factors, but one clear factor for me is that Al-Mansur, the third caliph, after having defeated the Christians in Al-Arcos, which was a big victory, he comes back to Cordoba and he makes Ben Rushd sit to his right in the place that until that moment had been reserved to a member of the shuyukh family. So you can imagine this was a very public statement that he was saying, there is going to be a change in the way power is distributed in the Almohad camp. And I think this must have been one of the main factors in Ben Rush's disgrace. By the time of Abu Yusuf Yaqub, which is the third Almohad Caliph al-Mansur, it's clear that part of this move is to put Ben Tumart aside as much as possible. It was becoming a sort of embarrassment, this idea of the Mahdis. The Almohads were Sunnis, and as Sunnis they had problems with the forced conversion, they had problems with the Mahdist figure, and they were trying, and there are many evidence that I'm not going to deal with them, I'm studying them elsewhere. And as I said, by the time of Al-Mamun, which is the fifth caliph, Mahdi is abandoned, at least for his reign. The coins, instead of Al-Mahdi Imamuna, it says Al-Quran Imamuna. But later on, other caliphs who rebel against Al-Mamun recover the original ideology. And as I said also, the early Muminid caliphs started a move towards philosophy. My proposal is that it was a substitute to Mahdism, because philosophy was a way of claiming to reach the truth, in which you don't need the Mahdi anymore. So it was also one of the ways in which the Muminids were trying to claim that they were able to ensure their subjects that they had the truth on their side. Now, Ben Rushd. Was Ben Rushd part of the Talaba? I have no doubt about it. He wrote a book, which I think the title is very revealing, مقالة في كيفية دخوله في الأمر العزيز وتعلمه فيه وما فضل من المهدي. I have no doubt that this is a book he wrote himself, in which he said, he told the story of how he had joined the Almohad cause, okay? There are some scholars who doubt it. It appears in a long list of Ben Rushd's works that is preserved in El Escorial, and these scholars who deny it, they say, no, this is false. All the others are right, but this is not by him. And I think they just cannot accept that Ben Rushd, their Lot philosopher, was engaged with the Almohads. And he also wrote a commentary of Ben Tumar's Aqidah, which is lost, although a fragment was identified by Muhammad Ben Sharif, and he talks about him in his book on Ben Tumar. Ben Rushd was not alone. Many other Andalusis joined the Almohads. Many others did not and deeply disliked the Almohads, and some of them were killed by the Almohads, but there were many Andalusis who loved that the Almohads gave them an opportunity to do things that they wanted to do. And in Rushd, the first books that he starts writing are usually mukhtasars, are referred to as mukhtasars or daruri, which shows very clear what he's trying to do. He's trying to create this, let's say, crash courses to start to change the way things are done. He needs to train. They need to train people in the Almohad ways, and for that they need books that can give a first quick training to these people. And that's what Ben Rushd starts doing. And when in this book, which is one of his earliest books, he says that the previous time lacked mujtahids, his own grandfather was a mujtahid. So under the Almoravids have a very bad press under the Almohads, but the Almohads are doing with the Almoravids a bit the same that the Andalusis are doing with the Berbers. In order to create their own identity, they are othering the Almoravids and saying that all the good things that we are doing, and the Almoravids did everything wrong. And we, as historians, should resist that kind of, they should not go where they want us to lead us. When he says that they lacked mujtahids, when his own grandfather, who was a Qadi of the Almoravids, was a mujtahid, This is a criticism of the previous regime and reflects the ideas of these Andalusis who consider themselves Ghuraba, which is, as we have seen before, this idea that was used also in the Kitab of Bentumar to say, well, there was this Zaman of Al-Ghurba, which required reversing the order. Who were the Ghuraba? What they had in common is that what they thought were the beliefs and practices that were right and true were not being followed in the societies in which they lived. And there were three main groups of Ghuraba. I don't need to explain to you what there is a hadith behind it that you all know, no? Bada al-Islam ghariban wa sayyaud ghariban kama bada. This is a very well-known hadith, and it has always been used by minority groups who feel that they need to, what they held is the truth, and that they have to do something, they have to become active in order to stop being a minority and become a majority. So those who consider themselves Ghuraba at the time of the Almohads appeared had different backgrounds and visions. I will deal with three groups. What I call the reformist ulama, both Malikis and non-Malikis. The Dhahiri ibn Hazm talks about the Zaman al-Ghurba in which he is living, and Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who was a Maliki and a student of Al-Ghazali. He did study with Al-Ghazali. As his interests were alien to some of the scholars of his age, because he was very much into studying the usul and going back to the Quran and Hadith and so on, and leaving the furu and the taqlid, he said, Sirtu ghariban bayna qawmi. He's the one who expresses this very forcefully. I felt like I was a stranger among. But he had the support of the Almoravids. They named him Qadi of Seville. So the Almoravids are not as bad as the Almohads tend to depict them. You will always have to resist taking what a dynasty says about the previous dynasty as the truth, this as a normal rule. And Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi tried to make certain changes. He seems, one of the changes he did is that he was the most popular teacher. So most of the the generations that came after him had been formed by him, and that was a pool of support for the Almohads. Then there were the mystics, like this man, very interesting man, active in what is now southern Portugal, called Bencasi, author of a very interesting work, which is a kind of philosophical Batinism, very interesting, that has not been well studied, called the Kitab Halal Na'alain, who worked as tax collector for the Almoravids, had a spiritual crisis. I like these stories, which remind me, I come from a background that is Catholic. It reminds me the story of St. Francis of Assisi, which is more or less contemporary of this. He abandoned his work, he created a ribat, like the ribat of Bentu Martin Gillis, and had followers, the Muridun. He didn't have tribes, because there were no tribes in Al-Andalus by this time, but he made an army out of his Muridun and rebelled against the Almoravids. And he called himself and his followers the Ghuraba. I will skip his story, but it's very interesting. And then there were the philosophers. Now, in Almoravid times, Benbaja, that I'm sure you know, explained that it is possible in the ignorant cities that some men arrive at an understanding of true doctrines. These men, he says, are called sprouts, nawabit, by analogy with the weeds that spring forth among planted fields. So he says, if these weeds were to appear in a perfect town, these weeds will be bad and they will cause the ruin of the perfect time. But these weeds, these plants, can appear in ignorant cities, and they can bring about the virtuous city. And he says, this, as long as they don't manage to get people to follow them, this may attain the union with the active intellect, but only if they live in solitude. And these are and he describes these people as ghuraba. He says, this is what the Sufis call strangers, because although they live in their homeland and among their citizens and neighbors, they are strangers as regards their doctrines. What is striking about Benbaja, at least that's what I found scholars who work on him say, is that when his predecessors have mainly dealt with how the philosopher should act in the perfect state, Benbaja is interested in how the philosopher is to act in the imperfect state, which is what Ibn Rushd is going to do all his life. And he states, their existence, that of the Ghuraba, is the reason for the emergence of the ideal city, as has been made clear elsewhere. He seems to be referring of a work by him that we don't have. So maybe Benbaja discussed this, how you can transform an ignorant city into a virtuous city. So that he also dealt with how you could bring about the perfect state. So all these people, as I said, saw in the Almohads a window of opportunity to bring about the revolution they thought was needed. And one of the ways in which those who joined the Almohads started to do that with the acceptance of the caliphs was to change the curriculum, to start producing works that will bring about the new type of scholar. And it's then when Ibn Rushd started the composition of these necessary texts, this daruri, providing sufficient materials on fundamental disciplines. He writes first his Daruri fil Fiqh, in which he comments the book by Al-Ghazali. Then he produces Mukhtasarat of the Organon, the Almajez, and the Anima. In his introduction to his Daruri fil Mantiq or Mukhtasar fil Mantiq, Ibn Rushd states that the search for the best is almost impossible in his time. And in the literature that I have read, they take usually this as dismissive of the Almohads. I think it's wrong. What he's saying is a pragmatic assessment. We need to produce books to train the younger scholars. That's what he's saying. He's not attacking the Almohads. He's saying we need, we cannot teach the best because we don't have the books to teach the best. We should start just by the minimum, and then move towards more complicated things. And he wrote a Daruri fil Nahw in grammar that has only recently been discovered, and is a very interesting text because, again, what he's doing is what Benmada did with his refutation of grammarias. He says there is no way to use the grammars that have been produced until now because they are too complicated. I cannot teach them to students who don't know Arabic. And he makes a simplification of grammar rules. Very, very interesting. This has been a discovery when I was preparing this. Okay. I'm going to go quicker because also so here I give a list of, without going into much detail, when you put what Ibn Rushd is writing according to the moment in which he's writing, you can see that he's not doing out of arbitrary way. He has a plan, and he's moving from the more simple text to the more complicated ones. And there is this moment in which he starts writing these attacks against the Mutakallimun and Al-Ghazali, and in it he praises Almohadism for having liberated the spirits of mental depravities and having opened the path for the people of rational speculation. So again, it shows that Ben Rushd is deeply involved with the Almohads because he sees in them the possibility of improving the training of scholars in the Maghreb. This is a famous, God has removed many of these evils, crimes of ignorance, and ways of error by means of this triumphant rule. By means of it, he paved the way to abundant good, especially for the kind of citizens who walk the way of inquiry, of rational speculation, and yearn to know truth. He called the many onto a midway, standing above the abasement of the mutakallidin, and below the form of unrest caused by theologians. The theologians are seen as people who, with their writings, cause confusion. They create problems. They never solve any problem. They are just creating problems, especially for the common people, while reminding the viewer of their obligation for thorough inquiry into the root of religion. And he has also this pedagogical approach on how to address different categories of people, demonstrative method with those capable of philosophy, the people of dialectics for the mutakallimun, and then the rhetoric and emotion, the emotional approach to the common people. But he was convinced, this has been also interpreted that he was dismissive of the masses, but I think it's just the contrary. He thought, he didn't expect from the masses what the masses couldn't give him because of different circumstances, social background, lack of access to education, and so on. But it's very clear that he thinks that their education should also be improved, and that's very clear because he includes women in this goal, in this concern. But he was mostly concerned with how to train good philosophers, because that's what he was all about. So most of his production is not addressing the masses, or of course not the mutakallimun. He's addressing those who need to become philosophers, because it seems that he had the idea that once you have the enough number of philosophers, instead of having ulama old style, you have ulama who are also philosophers, then the demonstrative method will reign, will rule, will become spread in society. Was he successful? If you take some contemporaries, he seems to have been successful. Look what Maimonides, when he's in Egypt, says. As for the Andalusians among our nation, all of them cling to the affirmations of the philosophers and incline to their opinions, insofar as these do not ruin the foundation of the law. You will not find them in any way taking the paths of the mutakallimun. That's what Maimonides saw the Maghreb at this time. And Al-Miklati, who is a mutakallim, he's against Ben Rushd in many ways, not completely. He says, when he explains why he's writing a book in which he's trying to refute Ben Rushd, he says to the scholar who has asked him to write the book, you mentioned to me that philosophical doctrines are in your region an argument extremely widespread. So it seems that at a certain moment, Ben Rushd is being successful. He's managing to spread philosophy. And this is very clear in the way he sees themselves. There is one of the students or scholars, modern scholars who have studied Averroes, has this metaphor to explain what Averroes is doing. And he says, we have to think of Averroes, of Ben Rushd, who is watching a football match. And he's sitting in the stadium with all the common people. And they are looking at the game being played, and when their party gets a score, they all race together and they start shouting. And Ben Rushd is doing that with the common people, but he knows better the game. But he feels with the people. And I think, I don't know if that's true, but it's one of the possible ways of understanding Ben Rushd. In any case, he doesn't want to be a solitary philosopher. He wants to be deeply involved with the society in which he lives. He wants to change things. He wants to improve education. That's his most important concern. He also doesn't like oligarchies. He doesn't like when rulers start putting money into their pockets and stop caring about the people. That's something that he criticized very strongly, okay? And then this race took place, and we can interpret in different ways to what extent this was the end of the story or not. I'm not going to deal with this time. I'm going now to pay attention to some of the views that Ben Rushd gives about his own society. Most of his political criticism is found in the commentary on Plato's Republic. I'm not going to deal with this. This is work in progress, and enough has been written about this. I'm going to deal with this. His views on Bentumart and Aristotle, his views on genealogy, on the Berbers, on enslavement, on conversion, and on his own work. But I think I will skip some of this because it's too much, and also I think I'm losing my voice. Oh, yeah. So, are you interested in any specific topic? Because I'm going to skip the rest.
Choice.
No?
You
Maybe
choose.
someone is interested in, and I can, huh?
First one.
The first one, okay. So, you remember that the way Bentumart speaks about himself in his kitab is that the Mahdi has no equal among humankind. Ben Rushd, when he talks about Aristotle, I mean, sometimes it gets even a bit embarrassing the way he puts Aristotle like above everybody before him. I mean, this is a sensitive topic because we are seeing now how people are referring to those who follow Donald Trump are willing to put himself in to say everything about him. I'm not comparing Ayn Rand with that, but sometimes any exaggeration in praise, I find it a bit embarrassing. So he says, has singled out Aristotle as the supreme example in order to present to us on human beings the existence of the highest perfection of humankind in a sensible and tangible form. I mean, he's also pushing his own agenda because he thinks Aristotle has a lot of solutions for many problems, so he wants to make it clear that Aristotle, and he has to present Aristotle against the Mahdi, and the Mahdi is supposed to be the perfect human being. So I think when he becomes so exaggerated in his praise to Aristotle, we have to put also in the context. Again, we have always to contextualize and think that the shuyukh are all the time pressing that the Mahdi is the real important person in the whole history of humankind. And there are many other texts in which God has distinguished Aristotle among all men. If we didn't have Aristotle's account, it would be very hard to arrive again at the same conclusion. It might even be impossible unless one were to find someone similar to Aristotle, for I believe that this man was a rule in nature, a model that nature itself devised to show us the highest degree of human perfection attainable in the material world, okay? So I don't think he would have gone so far had he not had to check the way Bentumar was being presented as the Mahdi. He has very little to say about the Prophet Muhammad, but one thing that he says that he had achieved the highest degree of achievement and perfection at Tamam wal Kamal. So, and to finish with this, he was critical of Bentumar. He never speaks directly about what he thought about the Kitab of Bentumar or about, but we know that in this period in which he is trying he's writing his works against the Mutakallimun, he's trying to make the point that to teach such a rationalist and abstract akida to the masses is wrong, because you are not going to convince them, they are not going to understand the arguments, and that it would be better to address them in a different way. Because you risk getting the disaffection of the masses because they don't understand what you are teaching them. And he says that, and he's made to recant, probably by the pressure of the shuyukh, who always were trying to preserve the image of Bentumar as the infallible imam. So criticizing Bentumar was a criticism against them. So he's made to recant, and then Ben Rushd, who is very good with words, says, well, okay, Bentumar had done it because of his hawas, of his hasad. You remember this term at a place in the Kitab. He had been forced to do it because of the disputes existing in his period regarding this issue, the presentation of God, and in order to put an end to the divergences with a knowledge that completed and illuminated the text of Revelation. So that what he's saying is that Bentumar had put an end to the ambiguity existing in the sources of Revelation, an ambiguity that, according to Averroes and his teacher Bentufail, it would be better to maintain. Because if you do it differently to people who haven't got the resources that philosophers have, then you are causing problems for them and you are not giving them a solution. So it's very pragmatic. Usually, sometimes Ben Rushd is criticizing with the theory of the double truth, a truth for the learned and a truth for the masses. I don't think that's the right approach. What he's saying is, this is gradual. You can see in the way he produces his work. He's going gradually. He's going step by step. He wants to advance. And eventually, maybe, he wants to reach a moment in which everybody is able to access education. When you read his commentary on Plato's Republic, there is a part in which Plato talks about the common possession of property. The property should belong to everybody, should be common. Nobody should appropriate the goods for themselves. It should belong to all humanity. And Ben Rushd talks about that and doesn't make any comment. He doesn't say that this would go against Islamic law, which defends private property and so on. And some wonder, did he agree or not agree? I think he was capable of imagining possible worlds. It's not that he wanted to impose that in his own world, because he knew very well the society in which he lived and he knew the limitations that existed, but he was able in his imagination to think that other worlds were possible. Okay? And I think with this I finish, because I think I'm losing also my voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much first for the effort despite your health situation. We are very sorry for this. And thank you for this overview on the context of the development of Ibn Rushd philosophy, and also, of course, all the background of previous Almoravid scholars like Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Hazm, and many others. And as we saw already yesterday, the distance that was able to people after Al-Mahdi, Ibn Tumart, to deal with nuances rather than really sharp aqidah of Ibn Tumart. Thank you so much. So the discussion is now is the moment of discussion. Please, we can take, let's say, 25 minutes for the first discussion before the work we will be doing for more deep in